Dear participants and attendants, following from the previous session discussed the economic dimension of smoking control and harm reduction, we have the privilege to continue this economic issue conversation. And we are very glad and honored to have as our guest in this session, Professor Michael Pesko, who will focus mainly on tobacco products taxation issues. Professor Pesko is a health economist and an associate professor in the Department of Economics at Georgia State University. Dr. Pesko's research uses retrospectively collected data and quasi-experimental methods to evaluate health policy changes. Dr. Pesko is particularly interested in policy changes affecting the use of e-cigarettes issues. So let me, dear Michael, allow me to make a short intro to the thematic of the tax treatment, especially for new tobacco products, before you start your presentation. Let's start with the finding that the role of taxation, especially indirect taxation, undoubtedly goes beyond revenue collection, as it is a highly effective tool to address either negative externalities associated with the production and the consumption of certain products, or the achievement of respectively individual policy objectives, like including environmental protection, health protection, and the control of public health expenditure. Therefore, tax treatment should be differentiated in accordance with the extent of the negative externalities to drive demand in the direction of less harmful substitutes, to promote industry innovation in developing better alternative products, for example, electric cars and renewable energy technologies. So, dear Michael, we are looking forward to hear your presentation with the title "Is Differential Taxation and Means to Promote Public Health Strategies?" Dear Michael, you may proceed. Thank you.
Thank you for that nice introduction and for making all my points for me so that I don't have to do it. Thank you as well to the organizers for the invitation. Okay, hopefully everybody can see my slides. All right. Yeah, so just by way of disclosure, I don't have any industry funding. I do have some funding from the United States' National Institutes of Health. The opinions expressed in this presentation are my own. So what do we know, research-wise about the effect that e-cigarette taxes have on e-cigarette use and combustible tobacco product use? Economic theory, pretty straightforwardly, would suggest that e-cigarette taxes, they likely increase consumer prices, and higher consumer prices then should reduce purchasing of e-cigarettes. It's a little bit ambiguous then what theoretically what impact e-cigarette taxes could have on combustible tobacco products, right? If raising the taxes on e-cigarettes increases combustible tobacco use, we would call that an economic substitute. It's also possible theoretically that e-cigarette taxes could reduce cigarette use, in which it would be an economic complement. Or maybe it has no effect on cigarette taxes, right? So that's an empirical question. We can go to the data. We can try to take advantage of places that have passed taxes, kind of look before and after, compare it to places that haven't passed taxes to try to figure out not only the relationship and the magnitude of the e-cigarette tax effect on e-cigarette sales and consumption, but also on spillover effects on combustible tobacco product use as well. And we do have some nice some good studies out there now And this evidence base is growing. So hopefully that's helpful for other questions, other countries considering e-cigarette tax policy. And so kind of a question that we're being asked in the United States right now. There's a bill before our Congress seeking to establish tax parity between e-cigarettes and cigarettes. And would this be considered optimal or suboptimal? Fortunately, from the United States, a lot of the tobacco policy is passed at the state level. And there are, at last count, 30 of 50 states do have e-cigarette taxes in the United States. And these states have passed different sized e-cigarette taxes at different points in time. So we have a nice staggered adoption that lends itself well to kind of rigorous empirical evaluation. And so what can we learn from these earlier state level e-cigarette taxes that might inform our potential federal tax, and that could inform possibly other countries as well in determining what their e-cigarette tax policies should be. So I'm going to walk you through some of these studies before I kind of make some takeaway points. So one of these uses Nielsen retail sales data for 35,000 stores. We have data from 2011 to 2017. During this time, we're able to look at the first 8 states that passed e-cigarette taxes in 2 large counties. There's some technical challenges in kind of standardizing these e-cigarette taxes in the United States, because some states use an excise tax per fluid milliliter. Other states use an ad valorem tax on the price that the wholesaler pays before the e-cigarette reaches store shelves as a percent tax. At least one state is using a sales tax, so that's not seen by the consumer, but it's assessed at the cash register. And then some states, they use different tax structures depending on whether it's an open system or a closed system. So standardizing is quite complicated compared to cigarette taxes, for example, in the United States, in which all the taxes are levied per pack of cigarettes as an excise tax. Very straightforward cigarette taxation. E-cigarette taxation requires thinking carefully about how do we standardize this into one unit so that we can better understand the effects of changes in that the size of the e-cigarette tax on use. And so just to kind of give you a sense of kind of how these magnitudes vary, one state, Minnesota, had a tax equivalency of $1.81 per fluid milliliter. One state had a tax equivalency of $1.24 per fluid milliliter. And a number of states had only 5 cents per fluid milliliter. So considering kind of the size of the tax, and it, not just considering if a state had a tax or not, but considering the size of the tax is really important for empirical work. And you can kind of see some of the distribution of the places that adopted some of these early taxes, and the darker shades of blue are larger taxes. So I guess our first question is, do the taxes increase consumer prices, right? That would be important if we, in order to think about economic substitution or not, we would want to first establish that the taxes do increase consumer prices. And we indeed do see evidence that when the tax is adopted, the prices of e-cigarettes increase. The most recent evidence that we have is it's about a $1 increase, and the tax increases prices by about $1. The pass-through is about 1 for 1. Okay, so now let's look at, this is using e-cigarette prices, but we instrument prices with tax variation. And this lets us back out some partial elasticities. So looking at the effect of e-cigarette price, instrumented e-cigarette price then on e-cigarette sales across these 35,000 different retail stores, we find that a $1 increase in the e-cigarette price reduces e-cigarette sales by 29% of the baseline mean. We find that the same $1 e-cigarette price increases cigarette pack sales by 10%. So this is suggesting economic substitution, right? And if we now look at instrumented cigarette prices, again with cigarette taxes, we find that a $1 increase in cigarette price reduces cigarette sales by approximately 7%. But then looking at the cross price effect, we see that the $1 rise in cigarette price increases e-cigarette sales by approximately 19%. So again, economic substitution, whether we look at if you raise the price of one product, it increases use of the other product. Okay. So we estimate then from this model that for each e-cigarette pod no longer purchased due to an e-cigarette tax, we estimate that it increases cigarette packs purchased by 5.5 packs within this particular set of retail stores that we investigate. So that's a very large rate of substitution, right? Some people might say that that's surprisingly large, maybe too large. We think it's possibly reasonable. I mean, for one, 30 times more cigarette packs are still sold in the United States for every one e-cigarette pod, right? So we're talking about cross-price effects of e-cigarette prices in a much larger market of cigarette prices, and so of cigarette sales, and so that could account for this large rate of substitution that we estimate. And it's also very concerning, kind of from a tax parity perspective, because if there is no e-cigarette tax, or if there's a low e-cigarette tax, and we're going to raise that all the way to parity, that's a very large increase, right? And so we're affecting the price of e-cigarettes, and then we could expect there to be very large effects within this much larger pool of overall cigarette packs purchased, right? So the large size of the cigarette market relative to the e-cigarette market makes the idea of tax parity particularly concerning. So if we wanted to kind of try to simulate this, right? And some people have asked me to do this for our Congress's current bill that they're considering. So the idea behind the current bill that's going through this reconciliation process is that they would first increase the cigarette tax by $1 per pack. So this would be doubling the existing federal cigarette tax in the United States. And then they would establish a first federal e-cigarette tax at the same level as the new cigarette tax, right? So that then would be a $2 e-cigarette tax increase per joule equivalent to 0.7 fluid milliliters. So if we took the numbers that I just walked you through, right? I said that for every $1 increase in e-cigarette prices or e-cigarette taxes, we would expect a certain percent increase in the other product, or percent decrease in the own product. We can kind of back out what a simulation of the estimated effect that this bill would have based on that particular set of numbers, right? And the bill as currently proposed, then it would be very effective in reducing e-cigarette sales by about 40%, right? Because this is a very large e-cigarette price increase, $2 per joule pod. That's a huge price increase, right? But the downside then is obviously the increase in cigarette sales, right? And so we estimate that even though we're increasing cigarette prices by $1, assuming a 1-to-1 tax to price pass-through ratio, on account of that doubling of the e-cigarette price relative to the cigarette price through the taxes, we would end up seeing greater cigarette sales even despite the $1 increase in cigarette taxes. Okay, so there's other options. So parity doesn't seem very good, but what do some other simulations potentially look like? Well, one idea would be maybe we could do a 50% e-cigarette tax relative to the cigarette tax, right? So this would be basically raising both taxes by $1. So that would land the cigarette tax at $2.01 per pack rounding. E-cigarette tax would be at $1.01, right? So e-cigarette tax would be 50% lower than the cigarette tax. In this case, it seems a little more reasonable. We still see a 10% reduction in e-cigarette sales, but a 3% increase in cigarette sales. So that still doesn't seem, it's certainly not a good public health outcome if e-cigarettes are substantially safer products. What about a 25% e-cigarette tax? Well, now we finally are reducing cigarette sales, right? We have that reduced by 2% by basically increasing the differential between the cigarette tax and the e-cigarette tax. We're increasing that because we're raising the cigarette tax by more than we're raising the e-cigarette tax. and some increase then in e-cigarette sales. And then if we did the 5% e-cigarette tax, and this is advocated by the Royal College of Physicians in England, that seems the best of all the different simulations that I'm showing you here. We see from a public health perspective, 16% increase in e-cigarette sales, but a 6% decrease in cigarette sales. So that is using kind of sales data, and we look at a variety of other survey data sources as well, and basically find evidence of substitution regardless of the population that we look at. This new study that we just put out using monitoring the future data from 2014 to 2019, we find that a $1 increase in the standardized e-cigarette tax reduces current e-cigarette use by 1.9 percentage points. It increases current cigarette use by 1.3 percentage points. This is among teens. It increases half-pack daily cigarette use by 0.6 percentage points. So that was an interesting finding, that it seems like the most intense forms of smoking, those are the disproportionately affected by e-cigarette taxes. Not only does it increase cigarette use overall, but it disproportionately increases the most intense forms of that cigarette use, such as half-pack daily. And if we kind of just compare the 1.9 to 1.3 percentage point change, approximately 7 in 10 youth that stopped using e-cigarettes due to an e-cigarette tax smoke cigarettes instead. And it also increases the perception of youth believing e-cigarettes to be equally or more dangerous than cigarettes by approximately 3 percentage points. We also use another teen data source in the United States to find, again, evidence that e-cigarette use is reduced by a larger magnitude than in the previously discussed data, but also increases daily cigarette use by more than previously discussed. And there's some nice data on where youth purchase their e-cigarettes in this data source. And we find evidence that it pushes youth from purchasing in retail locations and moves them more into social sources to get their e-cigarettes, which could be concerning if we're worried about those socially sourced e-cigarettes potentially coming from black market sources. If we look at young adults, in this particular population, we find the largest rates of substitution among all of the populations that we look at. Basically, 1-for-1 substitution among this 18 to 25-year-old population. Any movement that you make on cigarettes or e-cigarettes, it just pushes people right into using the other product. We use administrative data for pregnant women. United States has very good data on this. They ask about smoking at 4 different points in time for every birth record. There's about 4 million births in the United States annually, so it's a very large administrative data source, right, with good information on smoking. And from this, then, we find that a $1 increase in the e-cigarette tax increases pre-pregnancy and prenatal smoking by about 0.4 percentage points. And then using a different survey data source that has e-cigarette information, we find it reduces pre-pregnancy vaping by 1.3 percentage points and third trimester vaping by 0.9 percentage points. So approximately 1 in 3 pregnant women that stops using e-cigarettes due to an e-cigarette tax smoke cigarettes instead. And then we also look at for adults as well. In particular, the under 40 population, that's where we found the most consistent evidence of substitution. When you get over 40, it's a little less clear any of these relationships. People over 40 just don't seem to be responding to cigarette taxes or e-cigarette taxes, but under 40s, they are. A proposed bill, this was simulated for a different version of the bill that would have sizably increased e-cigarette taxes. A concerning finding from this study was it may have not necessarily pushed, but contributed to 2.5 million extra adult daily smokers. Some of these people would have been people that would have otherwise quit. Some of these people might be people that are now vaping that would be pushed back into a cigarette use. So e-cigarette taxes, they have the intended goal of reducing e-cigarette use, but they lead to high rates of substitution with cigarettes. It's been discussed, prior to this presentation. A concept is, instead of taxing at parity, maybe we should be taxing proportionate to risk. A few New England Journal of Medicine perspective articles have advocated for this position. The Royal College of Physicians in England, they specifically recommend a 5% tax relative to the cigarette tax. From an economics perspective, we believe that if we're just ignoring revenue, like the need for governments to generate revenue, we would believe products should be taxed proportionate to the externality that they cause, or the internality as well. If e-cigarettes are substantially safer products, then the externalities or internalities of these products are going to be substantially lower. And so there would be strong economic justification for a sizably lower e-cigarette tax compared to the cigarette tax. And setting e-cigarette taxes proportionate to cigarette taxes is suboptimal, even if both are raised simultaneously as being proposed in our Congress currently, because there's always going to be extra combustible use than if e-cigarette taxes were set lower than the cigarette tax. So that, I think, that's one use of this body of work. But one thing I want to just take a few minutes talking about is I actually think this research has much broader implications than just helping countries set tax policy. I think it tells us something about the benefit that e-cigarettes have as consumer products. So in the United States, the Food and Drug Administration, they have to determine if e-cigarettes are appropriate for public health. Illegal e-cigarettes are currently allowed for sale through enforcement discretion. The FDA is currently considering whether e-cigarettes are appropriate for public health, in which they would be made legal and allowed to continue to be sold. Hopefully the FDA approves some of the products, but they haven't approved any of them yet. Randomized controlled trial evidence systematically reviewed by Cochrane. They find moderate evidence that e-cigarettes work better than nicotine replacement therapy. But one critique of this review by Stan Glantz and others is that these RCTs are specific for e-cigarettes sold as medical products or including some kind of medical instruction or handed out in clinics. This is commonly done with randomized controlled trials, but this isn't the same thing as consumer products, which is what the FDA is trying to evaluate. And so some researchers say we should just ignore the RCTs when we're talking about if e-cigarettes should be approved as consumer products or not. So that maybe it is true that we can't randomize e-cigarettes as consumer products, but we can quasi-randomly assign individuals different access to e-cigarettes as consumer products by taking advantage of e-cigarette tax variation. So e-cigarette taxes, they make e-cigarettes a little less accessible to consumers. Therefore, I think these types of studies that use e-cigarette taxes, they tell us something about the effect that e-cigarettes as consumer products have on cigarette use. The evidence then is pretty compelling that when we make e-cigarettes harder for consumers to access by imposing taxes on them, cigarette use increases, right? So I think the FDA, they should be using these types of studies in their evaluation of whether e-cigarettes should be approved as legal tobacco products in the United States or not. And there's some other types of policy variations similar to taxes, minimum legal purchase age laws, advertising restrictions, kind of systematically reviewed these studies that are out there. There aren't a lot, but there's a dozen. And 10 of them suggest substitution. If we hear arguments that e-cigarettes haven't been shown to be appropriate as consumer products, I think we should be willing to point out these quasi-experimental studies as providing evidence that they do have benefit. Okay, and I think I'm out of time, so I'm going to not share some of these other comments that I had. Thank you.
Dear Mike, thank you very much for your interesting presentation, and I may say your impressive research findings about differential pricing of new tobacco products, especially e-cigarettes. I have submitted questions, so you can, from your experience, are your research findings in line with the recommendation proposal made by some researchers, let's say Frank Chalupka, that policymakers should consider an approach that differential taxes nicotine products in order to maximize incentives for tobacco users to switch from the most harmful product to the least harmful ones?
Yes, they align with that. And I mentioned this particular, I think this is one of the New England Journal of Medicine perspective articles. I mentioned that in my slides, but definitely that, you know, that was kind of that came out, I think, in 2015 before we had the kind of the data behind it, right? But now that we have, like, you know, the states have passed taxes, we have the data to evaluate that. It's kind of provided data to support this conceptual, you know, idea that was kind of generated early in kind of the e-cigarette era.
Thank you. And another one, recently the European Commission launched a public consultation on the taxation of tobacco project and new products. Do we have any preliminary early findings of the contributions, especially referring to the new products such as e-cigarettes, heated tobacco products, and other smokeless products?
What was the ending part of that question? I'm sorry.
The consultation in the European Union that has been closed, I think, a few months ago, and they are trying to find the European citizens' attitudes towards differential pricing for tobacco products and especially new products. Do you have any idea about preliminary data or findings or analysis of these contributions?
Yeah, I mean, I think this work that I just shared, I mean, I mean, if we believe, you know, if kind of the same, if it's generalizable to Europe, you know, the way that consumers respond in America to e-cigarette taxes, right? I think it's reasonable to say that could be generalizable for Europe, and so hopefully those studies are being used in that process. I am aware of one e-cigarette price study that Frank was part of, and some other people as well, that came out like back in, I think, 2015 as well. They used this price variation, right? You know, so prices that can be used as well. So cigarette price changes, e-cigarette price changes, even if not instrumented. So that might be, and that provided evidence of substitution there as well. And it's basically supporting kind of the differential taxation policy. So people could go to that study as well if they want a Europe-specific example to add to use in their advocacy efforts.
Okay, thank you very much, and allow me to make a wrapping of your contribution and everything discussed in our session. We may say that the relative taxes of tobacco products should reflect the growing data from scientific studies suggesting that although new tobacco products poses some risk, those health risks are rather less than the risk posed by conventional tobacco products. So, as international practices have provided few successful examples of successful tax differential strategies, differential in taxation could help and should help policymakers to encourage EU citizens to make less harmful choices for their health. Thank you very much, all of you, for your patience, and thank you very much for the organizing committee to give us the opportunity to express our opinion and to present the research findings of Professor Pesko. Thank you very much.
Thank you.